Everyone, my name is David Sandifer. I'm on the faculty of Tyndale Theological Seminary, where I teach in practical theology, and I'm going to be moderating our panel discussion right now. The way that we're going to do it is the first 15 or 20 minutes will be kind of a conversation between us with a couple of questions I'll be directing to the panelists, and then they'll be hopefully discussing a bit amongst themselves. And in the second 15-20 minutes are the questions which you have sent over to us. However, you have sent many more questions than we could possibly address. So apologies in advance to those of you whose questions won't be looked at. We will have another panel discussion tomorrow, and so possibly some of those we could get to tomorrow. The first couple questions are for you, Carl. But it's kind of a Carl plus setup, so I'll direct them both to you, and then would be interested if either of you have something to add to that. The first one is, I think, fairly straightforward and simple, but might be helpful for some of us here. If there's one sort of big idea about the strange new world in which we live that you would really like for Christian leaders to understand, what would it be?
Oh, that's not a simple question, I don't think. Partly because I think that the factors that have created the strange new world are somewhat complicated. Well, maybe that's the big idea. The big idea is this: there is no silver bullet out there that we can use to solve this problem simply. The problems afflicting society in general, and that I think have afflicted the church as well, because we are not hermetically sealed off from wider society. The problems can't be addressed using a single antidote. We need to understand the complexity of the origins of the problem as a way of allowing us to understand how rich and complex our response to the problem has to be.
Okay.
I don't know all that's going on in Europe at the moment, but I know that there's been a certain naivety among some Christians, at least in the United States, that if we can just get the right Supreme Court justices, or we can just elect the right person president, we can solve the problems. The point of my books is, no, these problems have deep-seated historical roots, so we should not expect to turn them around by this time next week. Like the builders of Cologne Cathedral, I think we are working today so that our great-grandchildren may have a saner world to live in.
Okay, thank you. That was one of the things I think that really was helpful about your book, Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, when I read it, was really giving us a perspective that the sexual revolution, which we think of as happening in the 60s, had roots that go back several hundred years in a really profound way. So I thought that was really helpful, giving that frame of reference. Do any of you have something you want to add to that? Okay. Second question for you as well then, Carl, is as maybe a counterpoint to expressive individualism is arguably centered around the idea of duty and obligations, and you brought that out a little bit today. Yet even as Christians, we're often allergic to focusing on duties, and often even present the gospel primarily in terms of meeting our own needs and finding ourselves and so forth. And maybe as Protestant Christians especially, we're a bit suspicious of duty language because it seems legalistic. So should we in our discipleship be reprioritizing duty? And if so, how do we do that well?
Yeah, it was a great question. I think the simple answer is yes, we should. And I think that one of the things that when I was a pastor in the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, my denomination, when somebody comes in to membership, they're interviewed by the elders, and there's a series of questions that the person will be asked to see whether they're able to take the vows of membership. But my elders and I would always ask more questions. You know, the usual questions: is Christ your Savior? Do you trust the Scriptures? Will you submit to the elders? Those are the sort of the standard questions. We would always typically ask people as well, and what are your gifts? How do you think you can serve the church? So we would try to sow in people's minds right at the beginning that the church is somewhere where you come to serve and not simply to receive. part of the problem I think we face today, and I hinted at it in my lecture this morning, is that, well, let's take a step back and say, religious freedom is a great thing. I'm glad that I live in a country where the government don't tell me where to worship, how to worship, or even if I have to worship. There's significant religious freedom. That is a byproduct of Reformation in many ways. The drawback, of course, of that is that it really shifts, as I hinted this morning, it shifts power towards the congregation. The clergy in the Middle Ages had huge power, because if you get excommunicated, you're done. You don't have another option. When I was pastor, in the last 3 years of my pastorate, we had 3 very unpleasant discipline cases that culminated in 3 very unpleasant excommunications. In each case, the person that was excommunicated simply went to another church. That's a very different situation than one would have faced in the Middle Ages. That is an unfortunate byproduct of religious freedom. Now, again, let me say, religious freedom is a good thing. But it's not an unqualified good thing, because what it does is it shifts the church towards being a consumer product. It turns congregants into consumers. I can't see any way to avoid that, but what it does, of course, is it dramatically problematizes the idea of membership of the church as duty. Because power really ultimately lies in the hands of the congregants. And Presbyterians like to think, well, that's a Baptist problem because Baptists are Congregationalists. But no, there are various Presbyterian denominations out there in America. You may not be able to get membership in another Orthodox Presbyterian church if you've been excommunicated in my denomination, but you'll find another Presbyterian church that will take you in. So I think the issue of duty is, yes, we need to cultivate a culture of duty and obligation among congregants, but it's not easy to do because you're relying on people engaging in a significant degree of self-discipline and self-regulation on that front. I'm going to talk about that a bit tomorrow, but I think, yes, we need congregations where people feel obligations and dependencies. How we create those is not easy, it seems to me.
Thank you. I want Jim or Mario, if you want to add anything to that.
Maybe just one thing about this from my own German background. The problem with duty, even though I like the concept, is that, for instance, in German intellectual history, the way duty was perceived, especially after Kant, was that the most dutiful thing that you do is that you do something that you actually don't like to do, and then you do it out of a sense of duty. I think this is not how we as Christians should perceive discipleship. So we don't do it in spite of the fact that we actually don't want to do it, but rather that love must be added as an element. So I agree, duty must play a role. There's an obligation to the Christian life that is also expressed in the Ten Commandments, but it lives off the idea that the Ten Commandments are bound by love for God and love for neighbor.
Yeah, and God's love for us is the source of those commandments, and so there's that reciprocity.
Yeah, I think that this idea of duty, it's related to the whole question of hierarchies, both of authorities and sort of expectations that are upon us. And I think that we all need to have our thinking transformed so that we see responsibilities, duties, even hierarchies of authority as liberating, as freeing, as creating the safe space in which we live. And anyone who has done a lot of something knows that the poetry of that something or the art of that something comes through the long struggle and out of the long discipline and out of the regular habit of doing whatever it is, whether it's taking photographs or writing paragraphs or reading the next section of text in Hebrew, whatever it is, the glory of it comes after and in and through the long struggle that comes with the duty of this is what I do. Even when I don't feel like I want to do it, this is what I sit down and do. That's one thought. And then kind of balancing something that Carl said, you know, it is true that people can find bad churches that will take them in. But in my experience in Louisville, we've had situations where we had a woman who divorced her husband, and she had no biblical grounds for the divorce. She had no warrant for divorcing him. And we told her, if you go through this, you are acting like an unbeliever, and we are going to discipline you out of church membership. And she said, I don't have any biblical grounds as you define biblical grounds, but I'm divorcing him. And we removed her from membership, and she went to a Baptist church down the street, and that pastor picked up the phone and called me and said, Wanda has been coming to our church. What's the situation? And I explained it to him, and he said, we're not going to welcome her to the table, and she is not going to be welcome to join this church. We're going to direct her back to you. Now, she didn't come back to us, but she was not welcomed. And then even in a non-Baptist situation, we had some people. Now, in this circumstance, their whole theological outlook changed. They embraced theonomy, postmillennialism, Douglas Wilson's, and that led them into paedobaptism. But they left our church in a gloriously loving, peaceful, non-divisive way. They were no longer Baptists, and they explained their situation to us, and they left humbly in a godly way. And so when a local PCA pastor called me, I was able to say, you know, I don't know where you are on the Doug Wilson issues, but he's now a paedobaptist, and we have no lingering issues with this family. They were godly in the way that they were with us, and they were godly in the way that they left us. And so it's going to be on you to determine whether he fits in your context, but we have no complaints about the way they conducted themselves. So all that to say, I think that if pastors will hold the line and work together, we can make progress in a good direction.
Thanks, Jim. And we'll circle back around to church discipline tomorrow afternoon, so that's a good sort of preview. You can hold on to the mic, because the next question's for you. And again, be interested, Carl and Mario, if anything to add to this. But you talked about how we are made for marriage, and I think that maybe caused a little bit of response. We had quite a few questions in relation to that. We'll get to some of them. But I want to relate that a little bit to some of the things that Carl's been talking about, and thinking about marriage as a kind of antidote to expressive individualism. In particular, marriage conceived, first of all, as a kind of normative structure, rather than primarily as a means of self-expression or self-fulfillment. Again, this is very countercultural even for many Christians who have absorbed a view of marriage as essentially sort of elective and for self-fulfillment. What do you think is the role of encouraging and elevating marriage in countering our late modern pathologies that we've been hearing about?
Well, I'm not a sociologist, but I'm vaguely aware, and I may get some statistics wrong, but I've heard these kinds of things, and I think we should be aware of these sort of shifts in our culture, and we should be prepared to discuss these kinds of things with people. Recently, I had a conversation with a pastor who told me that when he first began pastoring in 1970, something like 80% of the adult population of the United States of America was married. And now I think it's far less than 50. You know, the marriage rate has just plummeted. So if we were pastoring in the 60s, this would not be an issue. It would be normative, it would be the expectation, you become an adult, you get married. And then recently I also heard this other statistic that is just shocking to me. It was that 18%, so that's almost 20%, that's almost 1 in 5, 18% of young men in the U.S. between the ages of 18 and 30 are not married, not working, and not seeking employment. Almost 1 in 5, they're living in their parents' basement, playing video games and watching porn. That's what they're doing. with their lives between the ages of 18 and 30. No, they are not pursuing, they're not building a foundation on which they're going to build the rest of their lives. So we have a massive problem. And then you can look at the sociological information that, for instance, Brad Wilcox often publicizes. When you compare the life outcomes in terms of just something as basic as net worth of a man who gets married and stays married, as opposed to those who maybe never marry or don't stay married. And it is just a fact that marriage summons forth out of men responsibility. Responsibility to provide, responsibility to work, responsibility to do all kinds of things that are basic to society and good for society. And yes, and so again, I'm not a sociologist, but the Bible says it is not good for the man to be alone. And we can look at these sociological outcomes and say, see, this is where it leads. And I think that we should feel no compunction, no shame about saying to young people, you need to strive to be someone, if you're a young man, who can go to a girl's father and say, I'm asking for your daughter's hand in marriage, and that man is ready to hand you his daughter's hand. You need to strive to be somebody who's responsible, somebody who's respectful, somebody who's ready to take a wife. You should strive for that. And we should celebrate the goodness of marriage. It is astonishing, and it's always surprising that after God has made the man and the woman, the first thing he says to them, first thing we read, he blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply. They can't do this alone. They have to do this together. And what surprising delights and unimaginable joys come in obedience to the command to be fruitful and multiply. This is amazing. Who would have imagined this? Sorry if I'm talking too much here, but Sharif Gerges and Ryan Anderson and Robert George write in their book, What is Marriage? They speak of the comprehensive interpersonal union that is exclusive and monogamous and biological. And they speak of the miracle of a male and a female coming together in marriage, and their bodily organs function together to create life, new life. There's nothing else like this in creation, in all the world. It's just such a glorious reality. So I think we should celebrate it. I think we should commend it. I think we should encourage young people to pursue it. And all of this is going to be countercultural, because not only are people, they're not getting married, and they're waiting longer to get married, and that just creates all kinds of problems, because they form habits and expectations and norms for their own behavior that are all going to get, upended when they do get married. So there's a lot more that could be said, but I'll pass off the mic.
Okay, thank you, Jim. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, he mentioned Brad Wilcox. He's written a book called Get Married. And it's made some waves and gotten quite a bit of attention, and you might want to check that out. But I wonder, Carl, if you have something you'd like to add about... Okay, all right. I have a question for you then, Mario, which is not related directly to the biblical text. We do have some questions about that others have sent, but more in terms of your general framing of the question. You talk about the loss of certainties in kind of our contemporary society, which occasions these kind of questions. It's certainly one of the characteristics of our age. We don't sort of trust ourselves to make judgments. If you say I don't think it's good for young men to spend 6 hours a day playing video games, someone will say, says who? Do you have studies to back that up? Right? So we don't sort of trust our own judgment intuitively about these things. I wonder if you could say some more about how we should respond to this. I think of C.S. Lewis's statement that we have to return to what he called crude and nursery-like beliefs in objective values. Would you agree with that? And how do we go about doing that in the Christian community so that we're not destabilized by the questioning of all certitudes?
I think part of the issue that is going on here is that we are still dealing with the consequences of a 19th century lie that everyone has started believing. Namely the fact that we have told ourselves that by careful methodological approach to the world, we can come to objective truth without any subjective element in it. And that has led in the 20th century to a pushback which has questioned whether such a absolute certainty is even possible, and has rejected certainty as a category as a whole. And what I believe should be happening is that we should reject these false dichotomies. It's not either we have 100% certainty or 100% uncertainty, but rather we can trust that we can have reliable knowledge of the world, at least when it comes to certain things. Now, my own field of study is obviously the Bible, and here I would say that indeed we have a bit of a leg up in this because we were created to know the Creator, right? So God gives us the Bible because He wants to be understood. In the same way, we can observe creation to know God, right? There is an epistemically, as humans, we were meant to know things about the world. The world is understandable by design. And it is true that this sort of 100% certainty that people are longing for is unlikely to happen. But that was always the case, and it has not kept the church from confessing things, right? So I always tell my students, Arius also had arguments when he was debating the divinity of Christ. It's not like the fact that their counter-arguments means that we cannot know about things, right? We can know about things, we can find the better arguments and then confess these truths. Does it erase all uncertainties entirely on this side of eternity? I don't think so. But we can have reliable knowledge.
That's great. That's helpful. Thank you. I'm going to move over now to our questions from our participants. The first one is back to you, Carl. And this is in relation to Galatians 3. And the question is, because Paul talks about there no longer being male and female, the person asks, how do we relate and prioritize perishable old creation versus imperishable new creation? And the person says, it seems like the anthropology and ethics discussed until now are based mostly on the former.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it comes down to what you think the new creation will be like. Will the new creation be fundamentally discontinuous with the old creation? And I don't believe that, I mean, Jim would be far better qualified to answer this question than I would be. But it seems to me that we have no basis for believing that the new creation will be fundamentally discontinuous with the old creation. And I don't think that what Paul is talking about in Galatians 3 really relates to modern questions about gender. I also think, if we're going to be resurrected and have some kind of continuity of identity between who we are in this life and who we are in our resurrected bodies, then the sexed nature of those bodies would seem to me to be an important part of resurrection reality. Because for me to be me is for me to have a body of a certain kind. So I'm not sure if that's what the person is pointing to in that question. But it seems to me there's a bigger theological question behind that about continuity of old and new creation. And I see I suppose I could say, I would see no meaningful notion of me being resurrected and still being me if my body was so utterly transformed that the categories of, the creation categories, not the fallen categories, the creation categories no longer applied. Okay. It would, there's a whole lecture series I think, though, but that would be where I would go with that.
Well, we'll leave it at that, because we have a lot of questions, so I'll keep moving. The next one is for you as well. Why the strong emphasis on human sexuality as an aspect of today's world? There are so many other ideologies, trends, and events we need to take into account when bringing timeless truth to a changing world.
An emphasis from me or from the world around? How do you read the question?
I read the question as the emphasis from you.
From me. Well,
though I didn't think it was a particularly strong emphasis in what you said today, but it is in your book. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, the reason for the pitch of the book is very personal. It arose out of, I became pastor of a church in 2012, and one of the things that I very quickly picked up on was that young people in my church did not see the Bible obviously teaching the things that I saw the Bible obviously teaching on matters of sexuality. Now, that's not to say that I thought they were wrong and I was right. It's really to point to the kind of questions that Mario was raising this afternoon about, the horizon of the interpreter being brought to the text. And I wanted to know why the horizon of the interpreter relative to young people was so dramatically different to the way I was thinking about things. So I chose for the book sexuality, which also ended up connecting to gender. And again, that was for a very personal reason, in that the school district in which my wife and I lived in Pennsylvania in 2016 became the first school district in Pennsylvania to bring in transgender policies on bathrooms and sports. And I was asked and sort of teamed up with a local Roman Catholic lawyer whose wife happened to teach at the school. He approached me and asked if we could co-author a letter on this issue to address the school board. Only my name could appear on it because his wife would be fired if his name appeared on it. So the transgender question featured into the book, again, for a very personal reason. Having said all that, I do think that the sexual and gender, well, particularly the sexual, but also the gender dimension of the contemporary political culture of the West is a very strong and powerful one. I think it is more important than the racial question for two reasons. One, I think race is a relatively recent social construct in the way that it's thought about. And I could easily see race disappearing as a category for thinking within the next 150, 200 years. I think that the sexual dimension of human existence, for reasons I hinted at this morning, is a hardy perennial. We know, we go back to the Iliad, or we go to the Song of Songs, or we go to the stories in Genesis, and we can see how powerful sexual desire is. So I think sexual desire is not a social construct. It is a powerful force that has been perennial throughout human existence in a way that race has not. I also think that if you look at the radical exponents of racial theory, particularly on the left, in the United States, for example, Black Lives Matter, it's very easy to see from their own material that they produce that they see the race issue as a kind of subset of a broader struggle of which gender and sexuality is also, in their minds, an inseparable part. So I'm inclined to privilege sexuality and, to an extent, gender at this point, for the reasons that, one, it's going to be around if society, if the world still exists in 400 years' time, it will still be an issue in a way that race might not be. And the reason for that is it's a very, very powerful component of an intrinsic component of human nature in a way that I think race is not.
And I think your book also sort of highlights the way we've internalized a kind of Freudian sexualism that really prizes sexuality in the core of our identity. That's just sort of the air we breathe.
Yeah, and the reason why Freud is so plausible is that I think he's onto a truth. When Freud says, you are your sexual desires, that's plausible. That's plausible to us because 99.9% of us, our sexual desires are a powerful part of who we are. So Freud grabs the imagination, not because he's fully in error, but for the opposite reason, that he's actually, you might say, 90% true, I think, on that.
You can make a case for food, though, I reckon.
Food as well, yes. Freud would see a connection between the two, of
Fair
course.
enough, yeah.
But,
My questions have just disappeared, sorry. Didn't anticipate that happening, sorry.
you've been rendered weak by the technology that empowered you just moments ago.
So now this is back to you, Jim, and the question on marriage. And there's a couple questions here that I'm going to combine. How do you integrate your strong emphasis on marriage and the fact that we're made for marriage with the Bible speaking to the importance or the value of a celibate life for the sake of the kingdom? How do you interpret that? What do you say to those who believe they're called to celibacy? Also, someone else asked, what do you say to those who would like to be married and God hasn't opened that door for them? How would you address some of those questions?
Well, the last one is the easiest, I think. The person that wants to be married, I think the main thing to say to that person is pursue godliness, prepare to be a great wife, great husband, and study Scripture, get involved in your local church, pursue the Lord, and then find someone who's moving in the same direction that you are. So that one I think is the easiest. What was the second one? You threw a bunch of them at me.
Sorry. How do we integrate this strong emphasis on the value of marriage with the elevated role of celibacy, especially I'm thinking Paul's writings in particular?
Yes. So I think the evidence strongly indicates in 1 Corinthians 7 that Paul is speaking as a man who formerly was married and now is not. And I think culturally and historically, it is virtually impossible for Paul to have been the kind of man he describes himself as being, a Pharisee of Pharisees and someone who's advancing in Judaism, and for him not to have been a married man. For him not to have been married would have kept him from certain opportunities in that culture. So, and then there's linguistic evidence for the way that Paul describes himself. And I'll refer you to my friend Denny Burke's blog. He's looked into this and written on Paul and his statements in 1 Corinthians 7. So you can easily just Google Denny Burke, 1 Corinthians 7, was Paul married, or something like that, and it will come right up. So we don't know what happened. I think Paul was probably married. We don't know what happened to his wife. Maybe she died. Maybe she abandoned him when he became a Christian. We're not told. We have no idea. But I think the fact that those considerations make it so that we don't overemphasize Paul saying, essentially, I wish that you could be in a single-minded way devoted to the work of the ministry in the way that I am. He's not saying, I don't think, you should forego marriage in order to devote yourself to the gospel. And so I think that's a misreading of 1 Corinthians 7 that fails to take into account Paul's own history. And then you asked about people who maybe are celibate. I think that Jesus speaks to this issue, and he addresses people who, it seems to me, are clearly exceptional. And he says something to the effect of, only those to whom this is given can receive it. I may be misquoting slightly, but that's the idea. This is given to some, and it's only given to them. And that seems to indicate everyone else, the assumption is, you're going to move in the direction that humanity has always moved, and you should and will wind up married. There are going to be some exceptions to that, but it's always going to be exceptional.
Great, thanks. We're almost out of time, but we'll just maybe make the last question for you, Mario. And again, I apologize for those whose questions we didn't get to. I'm going to combine two questions here because both of them, I think, are saying that maybe they wished you'd been even stronger in your argument. So one of them says, as for David and Jonathan, would it also be good to refer to Leviticus and to say that both David and Jonathan clearly knew the prohibition against homosexual activity? And then the other one says, is having a story that's reasonably better, really the best we can do for supporting our theological conviction that David and Jonathan didn't have a homoerotic relationship?
With regard to the second question, yes, I think the best we can do is really coming up with a plausible interpretation and defending this one. And I don't see, unless we buy into the 19th century myth that we have sort of an unfiltered access to objective knowledge from God's perspective, kind of a bird's eye view of the world. I think the best we can come up with is a plausible interpretation that then also proves to be true in the preaching of the Word of God. So yes, I would say that this is, at least epistemologically, this is how I operate when I do expound the biblical text. And I do think also this is, we have to understand the Bible comes to us as a book. That's why I said it is more than a book, but it is not less than a book. And we need to read it with the methods we have at hand. And in history, right, the Bible is a product of history as much as it is a product of the Spirit of God. There are certain things we can do and we cannot do. So we can say with very good confidence that Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his armies, right? But can we go back in time and know 100%? No. But we can have reliable knowledge of that. So, and I would say that's the same thing with the interpretation. I think with all the plausibility that we can have in the world, I think it's I do not believe that David and Jonathan had any form of homoerotic relationship.
Just to fill that in a little bit more, maybe this is where they're coming from. Taking it maybe a step beyond that, if we believe the Bible to be the Word of God, inspired and internally consistent,
yes,
couldn't one go further than that and say that canonically it would be unthinkable that this would be the case if we take the Bible as inspired and authoritative?
Now you're asking the Leviticus 18 question.
So that relates to the Leviticus 18 question.
Yeah. Yes, I think so. Not so much. I think it's clearer with Romans 1 than it is with Leviticus 18. In preparation for my talk, I debated with myself whether I should include the whole Leviticus 18 story or not. I decided not to because it would have taken too much time. And the debate in scholarship on this passage is very graphic in terms of, in order to explain what's going on, you have to go into much detail about the different explanations that are given for this passage. In essence, there are two schools of thought. There is one school of thought that says that this is about a homosexual, homoerotic relationship that is prohibited. And then there's the other school of thought that says what is prohibited is not so much homosexual orientation, but a specific sexual practice that would denigrate certain people. And I don't want to go into more detail than this. So, for instance, one of the most influential writers on Leviticus 18 is a Finnish scholar named Martti Nissinen. And he has that argument that homoeroticism was fine as long as it didn't involve certain physical practices in the ancient world. I don't buy that argument, but I think it's much stronger to refute that argument canonically from Romans 1 than it is from Leviticus 18. And Leviticus 18 is difficult to interpret. Let me say this just as a final word on this. As a whole, Leviticus 18 is addressed to Israel as holiness commandments that are supposed to keep Israel free from the uncleanness of the Canaanites, which God wants the Israelites to drive out before them. And if you look at the structure of this passage, the last three commandments, lying with a man as with a woman, sacrificing your children to Molech, and a woman having sex with an animal, are clearly taken out. They're clearly emphasized. And those are particularly addressed as the unclean practices of the Canaanites. My hinge is, I think that this is something that was actually practiced. These things were actually practiced, things in Canaanite culture, and this is why God addresses that. And if we apply categories like homosexual orientation, we're just reading modern categories into the text. We're asking questions that the text doesn't ask. I would think that as far as it's potentially you can't express, do not engage into homosexual activities. This is as far as it goes in the ancient world, right? So that's as clear as it could get for them. And I think that must be enough for us as well. And then canonically with Romans 1, I think it's a done deal.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you to our panelists for your questions and your time. Let's give them a hand.